Rose Walker stood behind the counter of the Rooster's Nest, adjusting the steam dial on the espresso machine. She wiped the counter for the third time in the last 5 minutes, her hands moving mechanically as she hummed a tune under her breath. The cafe was quiet, the morning rush already behind her. The sun streamed through the large windows, casting a warm golden hue over the mismatched chairs and rustic wooden tables. Everything felt calm, almost serene, least until the front door swung open. The bells on the door jingled, and in walked a familiar face, though one that wasn't often seen during the more bustling hours of the cafe. An older man, rugged and worn, shuffled inside. His clothes were tattered, his face covered in stubble. His shoes were a scuffed pair of sneakers that looked like they had seen better days many, many years ago. But despite his disheveled appearance, he had a warmth to his eyes, a kindness that seemed out of place in such a chaotic world. His name was Tom, a homeless man who had become a quiet regular at the cafe. Rose always made it a point to greet him warmly when he came in, as she did with all her customers. But with Tom, it was different. There was something about Hema's quiet dignity, despite his circumstances, that made him stand out. He never asked for handouts, always paying for his coffee, even if it was just change from his pocket. Today, he made his way to his usual seat in the corner, nodding to Rose as he did. "Morning, Tom," Rose said, her voice soft but cheerful. "The usual?" Tom smiled up at her, his face creasing with age. "Yes, Rose, if you don't mind. A black coffee, no sugar, just the way I like it." "Coming right up," Rose replied, already beginning to prepare his coffee. The cafe was usually quiet around this time of day, but the stillness was soon interrupted by the sound of another set of footsteps. A group of 3 men, all sharply dressed in business suits, walked in, their laughter carrying over from the street. They were a stark contrast to the quiet figure in the corner. They glanced around, sizing up the cafe, their eyes quickly landing on Tom. Rose didn't need to see it to know what was coming. She could sense the shift in the air, the sudden tension, the way the men's eyes lingered too long on Tom. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Tom had been the subject of ridicule before, whispers behind his back, the occasional snide comment. But today, something about the men's energy felt different. They weren't just looking, they were sneering. One of them, the tallest of the group, with sharp, angular features, made his way toward Tom's table, a smug look on his face. Rose could feel her heart rate quicken as she watched the interaction unfold. The man leaned down, his voice loud enough for everyone in the cafe to hear. "Hey, old man," the man said, his tone dripping with mockery. "You lost? Or are you just here for the free Wi-Fi?" Tom's head lifted slowly, his eyes meeting the man's without a hint of fear. "I'm just enjoying my coffee, thank you," Tom replied calmly, his voice steady, though the weariness in his eyes was clear. But the man wasn't satisfied with that. He smirked and took another step closer, his friends following, laughing softly. "I didn't know they let burns like you in here," the man said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "Maybe you should leave before you start scaring away the real customers." Rose felt her breath catch in her throat. She had seen this before, people like him, people with power, using it to humiliate those they deemed less fortunate. It made her stomach turn. But it was different this time. This time, she wasn't going to let it slide. Rose set the coffee pot down on the counter, her hands shaking with a mix of anger and determination. She couldn't let them get away with this, not with Tom, not with anyone. She took a deep breath and walked toward the table, her heels clicking firmly on the floor with each step. "Excuse me," Rose said, her voice calm but firm. She stood beside the men, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. "I think you've made your point. Now, if you could kindly leave my customer alone, we can all go back to enjoying our morning." The men turned to her, their expressions incredulous, as if they couldn't believe a waitress was standing up to them. The tall man, clearly used to getting his way, raised an eyebrow. "And what's this? The waitress is defending the homeless guy?" He let out a mocking laugh, but Rose didn't flinch. Instead, she stood her ground, her eyes locked onto his. I'm defending decency, Rose said, her voice steady. And I won't stand by while you harass someone who's just trying to enjoy their coffee in peace. There was a tense moment of silence, and Rose could feel the weight of the men's gaze on her, sizing her up. But she didn't back down. She wouldn't. Finally, the man chuckled, though it was a hollow sound. He straightened up, brushing off the confrontation as if it were nothing more than an annoyance. You know, lady, you've got spunk, he said, his voice losing its edge. But it's not your fight. You should watch your mouth. He glanced at his friends who were still standing nearby and nodded for them to leave. Come on, guys, let's get out of here. I don't have time for this. The three men turned and walked out of the cafe, their footsteps echoing behind them. Rose watched them leave, her chest still tight with the adrenaline of the moment. When the door closed behind them, she finally allowed herself to breathe. She turned to Tom, who had been watching the entire interaction in silence. His eyes met hers, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Thank you, Rose, he said quietly. I didn't expect that. Rose shrugged, her tone softening as she spoke. No one should ever be treated like that. You're a person, Tom, and you deserve respect, just like anyone else. Tom nodded slowly, his weathered face softening. I appreciate it. More than you know. Rose returned to the counter, her mind still racing. She had never been the type to shy away from standing up for what was right, but this was different. She had never thought much about the power dynamics between people like herself, working class, struggling, scraping by, and those who had everything handed to them. It wasn't until that moment that she realized how much power words and actions could hold. The bell above the door jingled again, signaling someone else had entered. Rose turned, but her focus remained on Tom, who was now sipping his coffee in silence, his back slightly hunched, as though the weight of the world still sat heavily on his shoulders. But just as quickly as they had left, the men in suits returned 3 hours later, as if drawn back by some invisible force. This time, however, they weren't mocking or sneering. They walked in with purpose, each of them carrying an air of authority, their sharp suits matching the intensity of their steps. And this time, Rose's heart began to race for an entirely different reason. The door to the rooster's nest swung open again with a soft jingle of bells, but this time, the atmosphere in the cafe felt different. Rose was still behind the counter, wiping down the surface, but her mind was racing as she glanced at the three men who had just walked back into the cafe. They were the same men who had harassed Tom just hours before, except now. Their posture was straight, their expressions unreadable, and their steps were measured and purposeful. Tom, who had been sipping his coffee and trying to keep a low profile, immediately stiffened as he saw them. His eyes darted nervously toward the door, and Rose could see the faint flicker of uncertainty pass through his weathered features. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that something had changed. The men who had once been mocking and dismissive were now standing at the entrance, exuding an air of authority that made the whole cafe feel smaller. Rose couldn't help but wonder what they were doing back. Had they come to apologize? Or was there something else at play? She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She had dealt with all kinds of customers over the years, some rude, some charming, and others simply indifferent, but these men were different. They had been cruel earlier, and now they were back, as if they were intent on making something of it. One of the men, the tallest one with the angular features, locked eyes with Rose. His expression was no longer filled with mockery or arrogance, but instead something more inscrutable. For a moment, the tension in the room felt suffocating, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice smoother now, no longer laced with the sharpness it had held earlier. "Are you the waitress who stood up for the man earlier?" Rose stood frozen for a moment, surprised by his directness. The sudden shift in his tone threw her off guard. She nodded slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, that would be me," she replied cautiously, not sure where this conversation was going. "Is there something you need?" The man's eyes softened just a little as he took a step forward. We wanted to apologize for our behavior earlier. It was out of line, and we should have handled things differently. Rose blinked, trying to process what he was saying. Apologize? These were the same men who had mocked Tom just hours ago. What had caused this sudden change in attitude? Tom, still seated in his usual corner, glanced over at the men with suspicion, but Rose gave him a reassuring smile, silently letting him know that she would handle it. She turned back to the man in the suit, who was now joined by his two companions, each of them looking somewhat uncomfortable. "That's unexpected," Rose said carefully, still unsure whether to trust this sudden shift. "I'm glad to hear that, but I don't understand. Why now?" The man sighed, looking down at the floor for a brief moment before meeting her gaze again. "We're not just businessmen. We're involved in several charity initiatives in the city, helping those who need it most, including the homeless. But the way we acted earlier, it was unprofessional, to say the least. And we owe you and your customer an apology." Rose raised an eyebrow, her skepticism still palpable. "I see," she said slowly. "So, you just came back to apologize? No other reason?" The man hesitated, clearly weighing his words. Then, with a slight shift in his posture, he spoke again. "There's more," he admitted. "We've been running a project that aims to provide housing and jobs to the homeless population in Chicago. We're looking for someone with a real understanding of what it's like to be on the streets. And we believe that Tom here is the kind of person who could make a difference. We want to offer him a chance to work with us." Rose's eyes widened. She turned to look at Tom, whose eyes were now wide with disbelief. He didn't speak, but his expression said it all. He was stunned. "You want to give Tom a job?" Rose asked, trying to wrap her head around it. "A man who's homeless?" The man nodded, his face serious. "Yes. We want to offer him a position as a liaison, someone who can help bridge the gap between us and the homeless community. We know that we can't do it without someone who truly understands their struggles." Tom was silent for a moment, his gaze focused on the men in suits. His eyes darted back and forth between them and Rose, as if trying to understand the offer. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough but steady. "I don't know what to say." He trailed off, looking down at his coffee cup as if unsure of whether he could even trust his own thoughts. "I've never had a job like that. I've never had anyone offer me something like that before." Rose took a step closer to Tom, her heart aching for him. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, the doubts that he had carried with him for years. The harsh reality of his life on the streets had left him skeptical of anything that seemed too good to be true. "You don't have to decide now," the man continued, sensing Tom's uncertainty. "We just wanted to extend the offer and let you know that it's real. We believe that you could help us make a difference, Tom, and we're willing to support you every step of the way." Tom still didn't respond, and Rose could see the conflict written on his face. It was as if the weight of this unexpected opportunity was too much to process all at once. She couldn't blame him. After a lifetime of being discarded by society, of surviving on the fringes, it was hard to believe that anyone would offer him a chance to truly change his life. But Rose knew something that Tom didn't. People could surprise you, and sometimes a little bit of kindness could go a long way. "This is your decision, Tom," Rose said gently, her voice soft. "But I know you, and I know how much heart you have. You deserve a chance, just like anyone else." Tom looked up at her, and for a moment, their gazes locked. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the hope she had for him. Then, with a deep breath, he turned back to the men in suits. "All right," Tom said quietly, his voice a little unsteady. "I'll give it a shot. I don't know what I can offer, but I'll try." The man in the suit smiled, a look of relief washing over his face. "Thank you, Tom. You won't regret this." The rest of the day at the Rooster's Nest was a blur for Rose. She kept busy with her usual duteous taking orders, refilling coffee cups, and greeting customers, but her mind kept drifting back to the conversation that had unfolded just hours earlier. Tom's decision to accept the men's offer still felt surreal. She could hardly believe that someone like Jaime, man who had spent most of his life on the streets, was being given such a chance. A chance to make a difference, to change his circumstances, and maybe even help others along the way. After the men had left the cafe, Tom had lingered for a little while longer, sipping his coffee in silence. Rose had given him space, knowing that he needed time to process what had just happened. She had seen the doubt in his eyes, but she also saw something else, a flicker of hope, buried beneath the layers of uncertainty. It was small, but it was there. Later that evening, after her shift had ended, Rose decided to check in on Tom. She found him sitting on a bench near the cafe, his coat pulled tightly around him as the cold night air bit at his exposed skin. His face was drawn with the weight of the world, but there was something different about him now. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the cafe that morning. The offer from the men had shifted something in him, and Rose could sense that. "Hey Tom," she said, approaching him cautiously. "How are you holding up?" Tom looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He was silent for a long moment before he spoke, his voice soft. "I don't know, Rose. I don't know if I'm ready for something like this." He shook his head, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench. "I've been on the streets for so long, it's all I know." Rose sat down beside him, offering him a reassuring smile. "I get it. It's a lot to take in. But Tom, you're stronger than you think. You've survived so much. And this is just the beginning. You don't have to have it all figured out right away." Tom sighed, staring out at the empty street in front of him. "What if I fail? What if I'm just not cut out for this kind of work?" "Then you'll learn from it," Rose said firmly. "And you won't be alone. Those men there offering you a chance, but you'll have people around you who want to see you succeed. And I'll be here, cheering you on every step of the way." Tom glanced at her, his eyes softening. "You really believe in me, don't you?" Rose nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "I do, Tom. I really do." For the first time in a long while, Tom allowed himself to smile, a hesitant but genuine expression that lit up his face. "Thanks, Rose. I don't know what I'd do without you." The following weeks were a whirlwind for Tom. He moved into a small apartment, a simple but comfortable space provided by the men who had offered him the job. The transition was not easy. For years, he had lived in the shadows, drifting from one place to the next, never staying in one spot for too long. Now he had a place to call his own, a small sanctuary away from the harsh realities of life on the streets. The job the men had offered him wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. He worked as a liaison between their organization and the homeless community, helping to bridge the gap between people who were struggling and those who could offer them assistance. It was hard work, but Tom found a sense of purpose in it that he hadn't experienced in years. Every morning, he would leave his apartment and make his way to the organization's office, a small but bustling space located on the other side of town. There, he would meet with the team people who genuinely cared about the cause and about making a difference in the lives of the less fortunate. They weren't just businessmen looking to profit from the homeless crisis. They were people with heart, people who understood that change couldn't happen unless everyone was given a chance. And that's where Tom came in. His lived experience gave him a unique perspective, one that the team needed in order to make real progress. His insights into the struggles faced by homeless individuals helped shape the way the organization approached its work. Slowly but surely, Tom began to feel a sense of pride in his work. He wasn't just helping people, he was changing lives. At the same time, Rose continued to be his rock. She kept in touch with him regularly, making sure he was doing okay and offering support when he needed it. She'd often bring him lunch during his breaks at work or stop by his apartment to check in. It was clear that their bond had deepened. What had started as a simple act of kindness in the cafe had blossomed into a deep and lasting friendship. One evening, as Tom was finishing up his shift at the office, he received a call from Rose. Her voice was warm and familiar, and he couldn't help but smile when he heard it. "Hey Tom, how's the new job going?" "It's going great, Rose," Tom replied, his voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. "It's hard work, but it feels good to be doing something that matters, you know." "I'm so proud of you," Rose said softly. "I always knew you had it in you." There was a pause, and Tom could hear the sincerity in her voice. He felt a rush of gratitude for her unwavering support. She had been there for him when no one else had, and he couldn't help but feel that she had played a part in this transformation. "I couldn't have done it without you, Rose," Tom admitted. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Rose's voice softened, and he could hear the smile in her words. "You just needed someone to remind you of your worth." As the weeks passed, Tom settled into his new life. He continued to excel at his job, his confidence growing with each passing day. But there were moments, quiet, solitary moments, when he would stop and think about how far he had come. From living on the streets to holding a steady job. From feeling invisible to becoming someone who was valued and appreciated. It was hard to fathom, but it was happening. One evening, as he sat at his small kitchen table, looking out at the city lights, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had come a long way, but he knew there was still much work to be done, and not just for himself, but for the many others who were still out there, struggling. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He rose from his chair, wondering who it could be. When he opened the door, he found Rose standing on the other side, a warm smile on her face. "I brought dinner," she said with a grin, holding up a bag from their favorite takeout place, "and I thought you might need some company." Tom chuckled, feeling the weight of the day lift just from seeing her. "You're always there when I need you." "Of course I am," Rose said, stepping inside. "You've got a lot of people rooting for you, Tom, and I'm one of them." Organization had given him a purpose, and the quiet stability of his new apartment had begun to feel like a home. He was no longer the man who walked into the rooster's nest all those weeks lost, hopeless, and unseen. Now, he was someone who woke up every morning with a sense of determination. The shadows of his past were still there, but they no longer defined him. Yet, as much as Tom had changed, there were still moments when the weight of his past would creep up on him. Late nights when he couldn't sleep, when the familiar ache of loneliness would settle in his chest. And while Rose had been there for him, offering her unwavering support, Tom couldn't help but feel like he was still carrying the burden of years spent in the streets. He wanted to leave it all behind, but he wasn't sure if he ever could. That particular evening, after another long day at work, Tom found himself sitting on the steps of his apartment building, staring out at the city skyline. The night was quiet, and the lights from the buildings around him blinked in rhythm with his thoughts. He pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, the cool breeze biting at his skin. But it was a comfort to him, an acknowledgement that he was still alive and that he was still moving forward. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his reverie. He pulled it out to see a message from Rose. "Hey Tom, just wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" Tom smiled softly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. It had become a routinous checking in between them. Rose had been his constant companion through the ups and downs, never once doubting him. Never once making him feel like he was a burden. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt that kind of support. He quickly typed back, "I'm good, Rose, just thinking about everything." A few seconds later, her reply came. "Everything? Or just the good stuff? You deserve a little happiness, you know." Tom chuckled at her message. She had a way of making him smile even when he didn't feel like it. Both, I guess. "It's just hard to believe how much things have changed. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, like I'm not supposed to have this good of a life." "It's okay to feel that way," Rose responded, "but don't let the fear hold you back. You've earned this, and we're in this together, okay?" Tom felt a swell of emotion in his chest as he read her message. She had always known how to reach him, how to remind him of his worth. He typed his response quickly, before the moment could pass. "Thanks, Rose. I really don't know where I'd be without you." There was a pause before her reply came. "You'd be right where you need to be. And right now, you're exactly where you're supposed to be." Tom closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words settle in. He didn't know how she did it, but she always seemed to know what to say. The doubt that had been gnawing at him eased slightly, replaced by a sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he believed her. He was where he was supposed to be. The next day, he met with the men from the charity organization for a meeting at their office. The conversation was always about strategies, community outreach, and how they could make a lasting impact. Tom had become more involved in the day-to-day operations. And while he was still learning, He felt like he was contributing in meaningful ways. After the meeting, as he was preparing to leave, Mr. Bennett, the man who had originally offered him the job, pulled him aside. "Tom, I wanted to talk to you about something," Mr. Bennett said, his voice serious but warm. "You've been doing incredible work with us, and I've been impressed with your progress. We've been talking as a team, and we believe you're ready for something more." Tom raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cautious. "We want to offer you a promotion," Mr. Bennett said, his tone firm with conviction. "We believe you're capable of taking on more responsibility. You've earned it. And we want you to help lead our efforts. In a new project, we're launching a program that aims to build transitional housing for people coming off the streets." Tom's heart raced. The idea of a promotion had never even crossed his mind. He was just grateful to have a job, to be able to support himself. But this was more than he could have ever imagined. I don't know what to say," Tom stammered, feeling a surge of emotion that he wasn't sure how to handle. This is a lot." "I know it's a big step," Mr. Bennett said, placing a reassuring hand on Tom's shoulder. "But you've earned it, and we want to see you succeed. You have the skills, the heart, and the experience. We're confident you'll be an incredible asset to this program." Tom's mind was spinning. The man who had once been invisible, forgotten by society, was now being offered a chance to shape the future of others like him. It was surreal. But as he looked around at the faces of the men and women in the office, people who genuinely cared about their mission, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the people he had spent so long trying to help. The people who were still out there, struggling to find a way out. "I'll do it," Tom said, his voice steady. "I'll take the job." Mr. Bennett smiled, his face lighting up with pride. "That's what I like to hear. We'll start working on the details right away." As Tom walked out of the office that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. This wasn't just a promotion. It was a turning point, a new chapter in a story he never thought would have a happy ending. That night, as he sat in his apartment, reflecting on the events of the day, his phone buzzed again. It was Rose. "I'm so proud of you, Tom. I knew you could do it." Tom smiled as he read her message, his heart swelling with gratitude. She was right. He had done it. And this was just the beginning.